In this video, we're going to talk about impact, those few 1/1000ths of a second when the hoof makes its first contact with the surface. And I am using the hammer to represent the toe. So this is the pastern, and this is the hoof on the end. There's two main concepts we need to talk about. The first is mass, basically what is the weight of the hoof. And the second is how quickly does it decelerate. And that means how quickly does it go from moving fairly fast into the ground to coming to a full stop. That's deceleration. We measure deceleration in terms of G, and that can be anywhere between 20 Gs to 400 Gs, depending on the surface. So a very, very hard surface like this one, here this go crack, the deceleration on that surface may be as hard as 400 Gs. If we go to a softer surface, you can hear that's a much gentler impact, much deeper impact. So the deceleration there was probably still of the order of 60 to 100 Gs. So the hoof is coming to a stop very, very quickly. Where does mass come in? Well, here's two hooves of very different mass. If we now say this is a hammer and you want to drive a 6-inch nail into a piece of wood, which hammer are you going to use? You're obviously going to use the bigger one because the mass, when it contacts that nail head, gives you so much more energy of impact on that nail head than this one. Even if they decelerate at exactly the same rate, this still has more energy because of its mass. And that's the same with the hoof. If you have heavy mass on the hoof, it's going to induce a lot more energy of impact on contact with the heavier mass than the lighter one, which probably has some consequences for adding masses to the foot in terms of shoes. This is why one of the reasons why thoroughbreds run with very light racing flats. And if you're adding either heavy shoes or weights to the foot, they're going to have some effect on impact. What's really important to note is that the mass involved on impact is really just the mass of this part of the foot. You don't want the body mass of the animal. This part of the foot, let's say this weighs 5 kilograms. The body mass of the animal may be anywhere from 300 to 800 kilograms. You do not want that involved at all because the mass is just so heavy. So basically, by having the foot nicely stretched out as it comes into the ground, the only mass that's involved right at impact is with this region here. All the tendons are nicely slack. The connection, mechanical connection up the leg is relaxed. So that toe can bend quite nicely without bringing any further mass in. And why we want to do that is simply because the total amount of energy in the impact is the mass involved and the rate of deceleration. So if the mass involved is light and the rate of deceleration is as low as possible on a softer surface, you get a soft impact. If the mass is heavier, you increase the impact. If you take that mass onto a heavy surface, you maximize the energy of impact. And the energy of impact is really significant because that's where you get fractures of coffin bones, fractures of pastern bones, a lot of vulnerability for injuries of the hoof, anything from bruising to total fractures is at that moment of impact. So if you can soften that impact as much as is appropriately possible, then you're taking away the threat of injury of impact. You've got to be a bit cautious about that because if you make the surface way too soft, then it affects the later stages of the stance. So there's compromises you have to make. The surface has to stop the foot fairly quickly so that the energy of impact is as low as possible, but allow it to come to a fairly firm halt as soon as possible because you don't want that foot sliding out, and because that itself will cause its own problems. So you've got to have nice grip, cushioned impact, as little mass involved in the hoof itself as possible, safe impacts, but also reduce the potential for injury at this phase of the stance. I've talked about the energy of impact of the hoof with the ground, and at racing speeds, that's happening 150 times a minute. What would that actually feel like if we were experiencing that? So I'm now a crash test dummy, and I'm on the crash test sled, and I'm shooting towards a brick wall at 80 kilometers an hour and I've got no car around me. So when I hit that brick wall, it's just me hitting that wall. Imagine that scenario, hitting a brick wall at 80k an hour. That's roughly what the hoof is experiencing with every single footfall.